The tray hit the floor before I even registered the shove, and the sound of it, steel on tile, soup on paper, was louder than anything Petra Lindqvist had ever said to my face. Red sauce bloomed across the vendor invoices I'd been reviewing on my lunch break, the ones I wasn't supposed to have taken out of the building. The ones I'd circled in 3 places because the numbers didn't sit right no matter how many times I ran them. Now they were ruined. Now everyone in the Thorn Global cafeteria was looking at me on my knees in a puddle of minestrone, mopping ink before it bled through to nothing. Butterfingers, Petra said, not even bothering to sound sorry. She had a laugh that traveled, the kind built for an audience, and the Omega girls at her table gave it to her. You should really watch where you're standing, Calloway. I hadn't been standing anywhere near her. That detail didn't matter. It never did. My name is Wren Calloway. I am 26 years old, an Omega, and on paper, I am a junior accounts clerk in a subbasement office that used to be a supply closet, 3 floors and 1 entire universe below the executive suite. Off paper, I am the only person in this building who reads a balance sheet the way other people read a face, for the lie underneath the smile. I had known that about myself since I was 19, doing my little sister's hospital billing at a kitchen table by lamplight because the hospital's own accountants kept getting it wrong, or getting it wrong in a direction that was never in Josie's favor. Nobody at Thorn Global knew that about me. Nobody had asked. I was still on my knees, blotting ruined paper with a napkin that was doing nothing, when the cafeteria went silent in a way that had nothing to do with me. The double doors at the far end, the ones that led to the private elevator, the ones I had never once seen used, opened. And Vivienne Thorne walked into a room she was never supposed to enter. I knew her the way everyone in the building knew her, by rumor and silhouette. The Winter Queen of Thorn Tower, 34 floors up, who had not eaten in this cafeteria in the 6 years I had worked there, who fired executives with a sentence and never raised her voice to do it, who smelled, people said, though I had never been close enough to test it, like something cold enough to leave a mark. She crossed the floor in flat black boots that made no sound at all, and 300 employees found something urgent to look at on their trays. She stopped at my puddle of soup. Ms. Thorne? Petra's laugh had evaporated. I can call someone to clean. Vivienne Thorne did not look at her. She looked at me, on the floor, ink bleeding pink through my fingers, and something crossed her face that I would spend the next 4 months trying to name. Then the most feared woman in the building bent down, picked up my tray, and walked it to the counter herself. She came back 2 minutes later with a new one. Soup that wasn't cold, a sandwich I hadn't ordered, the kind with real bread, not the cafeteria's cardboard rolls. She set it down in front of me without a word, the way you'd set down something you were returning, not something you were giving. You dropped this, she said, as if that were all it was. Up close, the rumor about her scent was wrong in one detail and right in every other. It wasn't cold exactly, black birch, and something like winter iron, a scent with no give in it, no softness, nothing that asked to be liked. It filled the space around our table anyway, the way weather fills a room before you see the clouds. I opened my mouth to say something, thank you, or I'm fine, or any of the ordinary furniture of a moment like this, and what came out instead was, "You didn't have to do that. I'm aware," she said. Then her eyes dropped, just once, to the soup-stained pages still crumpled in my other hand, to the columns I'd circled in red pen. I watched her read them upside down in under 3 seconds, the way I read them, and something in her posture changed by a degree too small for anyone else at that table to notice. "Whose ledger is that?" she said. It wasn't a question. Alphas rarely asked things like questions. Vendor reconciliation, not mine to fix. I just noticed something. Noticed what? The cafeteria had started breathing again around us, conversations resuming at a lower register, but our table stayed an island. 3 vendors invoicing for the same shipment, I said. Different dates, same weight, same route. Somebody's double billing a ghost. Vivienne Thorne looked at me for one more second, filed something away behind her eyes, and said only, "Finish your lunch, Miss Calloway." She didn't ask how she knew my name. I didn't ask either. I just watched her walk back through the doors nobody used, and I understood, with the particular dread of someone who has been overlooked her whole life and suddenly is not, that something in my careful, invisible existence had just come loose. By the time I got back to my desk, HR had already called upstairs, asking why the CEO wanted my personnel file. The summons came the next morning at 7:15, hand-delivered by a man built like a door, gray at the temples, with the flat patient stare of someone who had spent a career making sure nothing surprised him. "Reese Calder," he said, not offering a hand. "Head of security. Miss Thorne wants you upstairs. Now works." The elevator to the executive floor required a keycard I didn't have, so he used his, and we rode up in a silence so total I could hear my own pulse arguing with the numbers on the display. 6, 11, 19. By 30, I had stopped breathing normally. Her office took up the entire northeast corner, glass on 2 sides, the city laid out under a gray morning like something she owned outright, which I supposed she nearly did. She was standing at the window with her back to the door when Reese let me in, and she didn't turn around right away. "Sit," she said. I sat. There was a folder on her desk with my ruined vendor pages inside it, dried into hard little waves, the ink still legible where I'd circled it. She'd kept them. She'd had someone iron them flat, from the look of it, which was such a strange, precise kindness that I didn't know what to do with it. "You circled 3 anomalies in a subledger you have no authorization to access," she said, finally turning. "I could have you terminated for that before lunch." "You could," I agreed. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "You'd also be firing the only person in this building who can tell you where the other 4 are." That got her. Something flickered behind the ice, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of the idea of 1. 4, at least 4. I only had 1 lunch break. She studied me for a long moment, the kind of look that made me aware of every unremarkable thing about my blazer, my shoes, the fact that I'd redone my ponytail twice in the elevator mirror on the way up and it still looked wrong. Wealth up here wasn't loud. It was in the floors, which didn't creak. In the silence, which cost more than shouting. In the way Reese stood by the door like furniture that could kill you. "I'm reassigning you," Vivienne said. "Effective today. Special internal audit, reporting to me directly. You'll have access, resources, and my authority behind every request you make. Why me? It wasn't false modesty. 6 years of being the woman whose tray got knocked over had trained the question out of me as a reflex, not a rhetorical device. She didn't answer with flattery. She answered with the specific, damning detail of a woman who paid attention. "Because you found in 1 lunch break what my last 3 auditors missed in a fiscal year. Because you write reconciliation notes in the margins for fun, apparently, which tells me you don't do it for the paycheck. And because," she added, quieter, "you didn't ask me for anything yesterday. Not a raise, not a promotion, not even an apology on Miss Lindvist's behalf. You just told me what was wrong." That's rarer than you'd think, up here. I thought about my sister's dialysis schedule taped to the refrigerator, the debt collector calls I let go to voicemail, the CPA certification I deferred 4 times because there was never enough month left after the money. I thought about how none of that was information Vivienne Thorne had any right to, and yet some part of me wanted, badly, to hand it to her anyway. "Where do I start?" I said instead. "With this." She slid a second folder across the desk, thicker, older, the paper yellowed at the edges in a way the vendor pages weren't. 22 years old. A previous discrepancy in a different decade that was never fully resolved. I want fresh eyes on it, eyes that don't already know what they're supposed to find. I opened it. The name on the personnel file inside stopped me cold. Elena Thorne. Senior bookkeeper. Terminated for cause. My mother, Vivienne, said, before I could ask, in a voice that had gone very flat and very careful, the voice of someone walking on a floor she already knew was rotten. She kept the books here for 11 years. Then, one autumn the company was short $400,000, and somehow, all the paperwork pointed at her. She died before anyone proved otherwise. I built this entire company on the promise that it would never again decide a woman's guilt because it was administratively convenient. She looked at me, and for the first time the cold in her face had something underneath it that looked almost like grief-wearing armor. "I think it's happening again. I think someone learned the lesson wrong the first time and is running the same play. I need someone who can read a lie in a column of numbers. You're the only person I trust to do it without already believing what everyone upstairs wants to believe." The window behind her framed the whole gray sprawl of the city, and against it she looked less like the winter queen of rumor and more like a woman standing very still so that something wouldn't fall out of her. "Whose desk do I start with?" I asked. "Corbin Vale's," she said. Carefully. Working for Vivienne Thorne meant working late, and working late meant discovering, in increments too small to argue with, the parts of her that never made the rumor mill. She sent food to my office door without being asked, not from the executive kitchen, but once, unmistakably, a container of tomato soup with the particular burnt butter finish my mother used to make. The recipe I'd mentioned once, offhand, to my friend Dee over cafeteria trays, never once imagining it would travel 34 floors and land warm on my desk with no note attached. I didn't ask how she knew. I was starting to understand that Vivienne Thorne heard everything in this building. She simply chose, almost always, to say nothing about what she heard. Corbin Vale, for his part, noticed my reassignment within the week and did not bother hiding his opinion of it. He was CFO, 51, built like a man who'd once played contact sports and never stopped carrying himself like he still did, and he had a way of looking at omegas in meetings that made you feel like furniture that had been asked an insolent question. "Heard you're Thorne's new pet project," he said, cornering me by the copier on my 4th day upstairs. "Cute. She does this every few years. Finds herself astray, plays savior for a season. Doesn't usually end well for the stray." "Is that a threat, Mr. Vale?" "It's context." He smiled, the kind of smile that had never once needed to reach his eyes to work on the people it was aimed at. "You're an omega running numbers in a men's department, sweetheart. Enjoy the view from up here while it lasts." I didn't tell Vivienne about it. I told the ledgers instead, and the ledgers, 3 nights later, told me back. A shell logistics vendor registered to a P.O. box 11 miles from Corbin Vale's lake house, invoicing Thorne Global for shipments that, according to the actual freight logs, had never left the warehouse. I found the connection to the old file by accident, at 2 a.m, cross-referencing signature stamps out of pure stubbornness. Elena Thorne's termination letter had been co-signed by a junior finance officer 22 years ago. The signature was cramped, young, unpracticed, but the loop on the C was unmistakable. The same loop that sprawled across every invoice I'd been chasing for a week. Corbin Vale had signed both. I sat very still in my little glass office at midnight with the two signatures side by side, and I understood, with the specific vertigo of someone realizing a story is bigger and older and crueler than she thought, that I was not looking at one crime. I was looking at the same crime, worn thin and repeated, 22 years apart, on two different women who had never asked to be anyone's convenient answer. The storm hit that same night, the kind the city wasn't built for, and it took the tower's backup power with it floor by floor until only the executive level held light. Rice found me still in my office at midnight, laptop glowing, coat still on because the heat had gone with the power, and instead of sending me home in a storm with no trains running, he brought me up to Vivienne's floor, where at least there was light and a fireplace that, absurdly, actually worked. She was still at her desk when I came in, soaked at the shoulders from crossing the sky bridge. And she looked up at me the way she'd looked at the vendor pages that first day, like something worth reading twice. "You found something," she said. Not a question. She'd learned that about me already. "I found everything." I set the laptop down between us, hands not quite steady, and walked her through it. The shell company, the PO box, the freight logs that didn't match, the signature loop that connected a crime from this year to a woman who died, disgraced 22 years before either of us was old enough to fix it. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The fire cracked. Outside, the storm threw itself against 34 floors of glass like it had a grievance of its own. He signed her termination, Vivienne said finally, very quietly, staring at the screen like it might rearrange itself into something kinder. He was 29, junior, nobody. And he watched my mother lose everything for a number he wrote wrong on purpose, and then he spent the next 2 decades climbing the ladder built out of her disgrace. "I can prove it," I said. "Not tonight, but I can. I know you can." She looked at me then, and the ice was gone entirely, worn through by something rawer. "Do you understand what it cost me, learning that control was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you? My father taught me that grief was a liability, that the moment you let someone matter, you hand them the knife. I have run this company for 9 years on that lesson, and I have never once let it be untrue." Her voice caught, just slightly, on the next part, until a woman knelt in soup on my cafeteria floor and told me the truth instead of an apology, and I found I couldn't stop thinking about her. The fire popped again. My chest had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. "Vivienne, tell me to stop," she said, "and I will." She hadn't moved. It was, somehow, the least alpha thing I had ever heard her say, and the most. "Don't stop," I said. She crossed the space between us slowly, giving me every second to change my mind, and when her hand finally found my jaw, it was careful in a way her reputation had never once suggested she could be. Up close, her scent had gone warmer than winter iron, something underneath the cold that smelled almost like relief. I felt her breath catch a half second before mine did. The door slammed open before either of us moved another inch, Reese filling the frame with a face gone gray. "Corbinvale filed a formal complaint an hour ago," he said, not bothering with preamble. "Misuse of confidential systems. Miss, Calloway's name is on it. Legal's already suspended her access pending review." Vivienne's hand stayed exactly where it was for one more second, like she was memorizing the shape of the moment before it was taken from her. "Get me legal," she said. "Now." They put me on administrative leave the next morning, which was Corbin's word for house arrest with better lighting. I couldn't badge into the building. I couldn't touch the ledgers I'd spent 2 weeks turning inside out. What I could do, apparently, was sit in the guest suite of a penthouse 34 floors above the street, drinking coffee that cost more than my monthly train pass, while Vivienne fought a board that increasingly wondered aloud whether their CEO's judgment had been compromised by an Omega clerk half her rank. She insisted the suite was for my safety, not sentiment. Corbin had reach, she said. And reach meant knowing exactly which subbasement apartment building I lived in, and I let her insist, because arguing with Vivienne Thorne about my own protection was like arguing with weather. It was in that apartment, on the second night, that she cooked for me. Actually cooked, sleeves rolled, an apron that clearly belonged to someone else since it hung comically large on her, standing over a pot of tomato soup with the burnt butter finish, trying and mostly failing to hide that she was nervous about it. "You didn't have to learn the recipe," I said, watching from the doorway. "I asked your friend Dee for it. She extracted a promise that I would, quote, treat you right, or answer to her personally." A ghost of a smile. I found that an acceptable term. I laughed, actually laughed, the first time in days, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch at the sound of it. We ate at the counter instead of the table that could have seated 12, and somewhere between the second bowl and the rain starting again outside the floor to ceiling glass, she told me the rest of it. Her mother's voice, which she said she was starting to forget the sound of the years after, being raised by a father who measured love in liabilities and taught her that the surest way to survive was to never again let anyone matter enough to be used against her. The particular loneliness of being feared by everyone and known by no one. "I didn't build an empire," she said, turning her water glass slowly on the counter, not looking at me. "I built a fortress. I just called it success, so it would sound like a choice." And now? Now there's a woman in my guest room who found in 14 days what I couldn't find in 9 years, she said, and I would burn the fortress down before I let it touch her. I set my spoon down. My chest did the thing it kept doing around her lately, tightened, then opened, like a door learning how to swing both ways. "I want to see the scars," I said. "Not the fortress. You," she showed me. Not literal wounds. The ones that mattered were older than skin, but she told me about the eviction after her mother's death, about sleeping in a car at 15 while her father rebuilt his image instead of his family, about the first time she'd made a grown man cry in a boardroom and gone home afterward and cried harder than he had, alone, where no one could use it against her. I told her about Josie, about the kitchen table billing disputes, about deferring my CPA exam 4 times because there was never a month where the money and the time existed at once, about how being unremarkable had felt, for 6 years, like the only safe thing left to be. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, without either of us quite deciding to, her forehead came to rest against mine, and this time when she asked, "Ask me with your words, Ren," I did, and the kiss that followed had none of the winter left in it at all. The smear story broke 2 days later, timed with a precision that told me exactly whose hand was behind it. Thorne's Omega favorite. Fraud cover or something more? A headline built to imply everything and confirm nothing. Sourced, unmistakably, from someone inside the building who'd seen us leave together after midnight. By noon, the board had called an emergency session. By 2, Vivienne was standing in front of a bank of cameras in the tower's lobby, jaw set in the exact granite expression I'd first seen across a cafeteria full of frightened silence, denying, flatly, publicly, with no hesitation I could detect from where I stood at the back of the room, that there was any relationship, personal or otherwise, between herself and a junior employee named in an ongoing internal review. I watched her do it and felt something in my chest go from open back to shut in under 4 seconds. She didn't look at me once. Not when the reporters shouted follow-ups. Not when Reese stepped in to end the questions. Not when I turned, quietly, and let myself out the side door before anyone could photograph my face doing whatever it was doing. 2 hours later, HR delivered the rest of it in a manila envelope. My leave was being converted, effective immediately, to termination, pending the outcome of Corbin Vale's complaint. A security escort walked me to my old subbasement desk, waited while I put 6 years of unremarkable belongings into a single cardboard box, and walked me out through the loading dock so I wouldn't be seen leaving through the lobby. I stood on the curb in the rain that hadn't stopped since the night of the storm, holding a box that contained a coffee mug, a photo of Josie at 9 years old missing her front teeth, and a small terracotta cup with a marigold cutting I'd carried from my mother's garden 6 years ago and somehow kept alive through every bad apartment since. It felt, absurdly, like the truest measurement of everything I had ever been allowed to keep. I did not cry until I was 3 blocks away, and then I did, hard, the way you cry when the worst part isn't the ending, but the specific, humiliating clarity of finally understanding you'd let yourself believe in something. I gave myself exactly 1 night to grieve it. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a laptop that still, miraculously, held a mirrored copy of every file I'd pulled before legal locked my access, and I did the only thing I have ever been good at when the world takes everything else away from me. I followed the numbers. By 4 a.m, I had it whole, the shell company's full ownership chain, routed through 2 offshore holding entities back to a name that traced, eventually and unmistakably, to Corbin Vale's brother-in-law. The signature loop from the old termination letter matched letter for letter against 6 recent invoices, a timeline that put Corbin authorizing corrective transfers the same week he'd filed his complaint against me. A man burying a fresh theft under the noise of an old scandal he'd manufactured twice now, 22 years apart, using the same tactic both times: find an Omega woman close to the money and let the company's own prejudice do the rest of the work for him. I didn't call Vivienne. I couldn't yet, not with my chest still raw from watching her deny me on camera. Dramatic irony be damned. I called Reese instead at 5 a.m. and read him every line until his silence on the other end turned into something that sounded almost like respect. She didn't mean what she said, he told me, before I could hang up. You should know that. 15 years I've worked for that woman, Miss Calloway. I have never once seen her wait for an elevator instead of taking the stairs faster. I have never seen her cancel a board meeting for anything. She canceled one this morning. For you. I didn't have time to ask what that meant, because that was the exact moment my apartment door gave way under a shoulder that wasn't mine. There were 2 of them. Big, unhurried. The kind of men who got paid by people like Corbin Vale to make problems disappear without a paper trail. I got as far as the fire escape before the first one caught my wrist hard enough to leave a mark, and I was still calculating the drop to the alley below. Too far, too fast, not survivable, when the door behind them exploded inward a second time, and Vivienne Thorne walked through it like weather that had finally decided where it was going. She didn't say anything clever. She didn't monologue. She put herself between me and the larger man with the flat efficiency of someone who had trained her body the same relentless way she'd trained her company, and when his fist came around, she took it across the cheekbone rather than let it land anywhere near me. I have never in my life moved as fast as I moved then, closing the gap, getting a lamp cord around the second man's arm long enough for Reese and 2 officers to come through what was left of my door. It was over in under a minute. It felt like an hour. Corbin Vale, arrested 3 blocks away trying to reach the airport with a hard drive and a passport that wasn't his, took considerably longer to feel like it was over at all. Vivienne was on her knees in my ruined living room afterward, blood at her cheekbone, hands shaking now that there was finally nothing left to fight, and when I reached for her, she flinched, not from me, I understood, but from the terror of having almost lost the one thing she'd spent 9 years teaching herself not to need. "I denied you," she said, before I could speak, in front of every camera in the city. "I need you to know it was never true. It was the only way to make him move before he buried the rest of the evidence. I would have told you. I was going to tell you the second it was safe, and instead I know, I said, and found that I did, entirely, the way I knew a column of numbers was lying before I could prove it. You carried my tray without being asked. A press conference was never going to undo that." She laughed, a wrecked, startled sound, half-sob, and pulled me against her hard enough that I felt her heartbeat through both our coats, black birch and winter iron gone warm and unguarded around us for the first time since the storm. Later, once the second man had stopped struggling in her grip against the wall, once his friend had confessed everything in the desperate rush of someone hoping cooperation might buy him something, I watched Vivienne's hand tighten around a fistful of his collar with a violence that had nothing left of restraint in it. "Vivienne," I put my hand over hers, over the pulse jumping in her wrist. "Stop, let him be arrested. Don't let him make you into the thing your father was." She looked at me for one long breath, jaw tight, and then, slowly, opened her hand. "Even now," she said, quiet, wondering, "you're the mercy in the room." The board convened at 9 the next morning in a glass conference room on the 34th floor, and this time I was in it, seated at Vivienne's right hand with a folder 6 weeks in the making open on the table in front of me. Corbin Vale sat across from us in a suit that had been pressed for a very different morning, flanked by lawyers who kept glancing at the door like it might still save him. I walked the room through it myself, at Vivienne's insistence, because, she said, it was my work and my name that deserved to be attached to it in the record. I laid out the shell company, the offshore chain, the signature that connected a theft this year to a disgrace 22 years old. I played the recording Reese's officers had pulled from the second man's phone, in which Corbin, thinking himself unheard, instructed his hired help in language that left no reasonable doubt about intent. Petra Lindqvist, called as a witness to corroborate the original complaint against me, folded within 4 minutes under a single question about who had told her to file it, and admitted, white-faced, that Corbin had promised her a supervisory promotion in exchange for manufacturing a paper trail against the girl who noticed things. She was escorted out shortly after. I did not enjoy watching it as much as I'd once imagined I would, and I found I didn't need to. The room's collective silence, the sound of a dozen people who had once laughed along with her now looking anywhere but at her, did the work well enough on its own. Corbin Vale's lawyers stopped objecting around the point where I read, aloud, the exact date and dollar figure of the transfer that had ended Elena Thorne's life 22 years before her son had never had the chance to know her. "You built a career on the theory that no one checks the numbers on a woman nobody believes," I told him, and it was the only thing I said to him directly. The whole meeting. "You were wrong twice. That's arrogance, not luck." The board voted for his termination and full cooperation with the district attorney's office before I'd even sat back down. 2 officers were waiting for him at the elevator. I watched Reese walk him to it personally, without a single word, and something in the set of the old security chief's shoulders looked, for the first time since I'd met him, entirely at ease. Vivienne stood afterward at the head of the table, in front of a board that had spent a week doubting her judgment, and said, simply, "I owe all of you a correction." The woman you tried to have removed from this building for asking questions is the reason it's still standing. I intend to keep her close, in every sense of that phrase, and any of you who has a problem with that is welcome to bring it to me directly. Her eyes found mine across the table, steady, unguarded, winter finally, entirely thawed. I will always carry her tray. I'd carry considerably more than that if she'd let me. Nobody in that room laughed at me again. Not that day, not after. 6 weeks later, she asked me to marry her in the kitchen of the penthouse. No cameras, no board, just the two of us and a pot of tomato soup she'd finally learned to make without a recipe card, a small worn box produced from her coat pocket with hands that were, for once, not entirely steady. I have negotiated hostile takeovers without flinching, she said, kneeling on the same floor where she'd once cooked nervously in a borrowed apron, and I have never in my life been this afraid of a single yes or no. Ask me anyway, I said, laughing through it, because some habits between us had become permanent. She did. I said yes before she finished the sentence. We bonded in early spring, in a garden she'd had planted specifically for the occasion. Every bed full of marigolds, a whole hillside of them, orange and gold, because I'd once told her, half asleep against her shoulder, that my mother's garden had never had enough room for the seeds I wanted to plant. The claiming happened that same night, gentle and asked for and answered, her mouth at my throat only after every word of consent had passed between us twice, and the bond that settled into place afterward felt less like being marked and more like finally being finished, the way a column finally balances after you've found the one entry that was hiding. Reese gave the only toast that made me cry, standing at the reception with a glass raised and an expression that had gone, over the months, from suspicion to something closer to fond exasperation. 15 years, he said, I watched that woman build walls for a living. Then a tray of soup hit a cafeteria floor, and I watched them come down in about 4 minutes flat. I've never seen anything like it. I hope I never do again. My heart can't take a second one. D, who had extracted a formal recipe sharing agreement from Vivienne months earlier and never let either of us forget it, gave the second toast, considerably less dignified and considerably more accurate. A year on, Josie stood at that same garden fence in remission after the transplant Vivienne's medical fund had quietly, insistently made possible before either of us had ever said the word marriage aloud. A debt paid not as a transaction, but, Vivienne insisted, as an apology on behalf of a company that had once let one sister disappear rather than see her. I keep, in our kitchen now, on a shelf above the stove where the morning light finds it first, the same battered steel tray from that first cafeteria collision, dented, one corner still taped, rescued from a supply closet the week Corbin Vale was sentenced, and Petra Lindvist quietly let go. Vivienne had it polished, not replaced. She said the dents were the only part of the story worth keeping shiny. Most mornings now she is awake before me, and most mornings, without being asked, I find breakfast already carried to the table where I'll sit. Eggs, or the soup when the weather turns, marigolds cut fresh from the garden in a chipped teacup at the center of it. It is such a small thing. It has never once, not one single morning since, stopped meaning everything. I used to believe that being unremarkable was the safest thing a woman like me could be. I know now that it was only ever the loneliest. Being seen costs something, it always does, but it was never as much as the price of staying invisible, and no one had to teach me that twice. Once someone finally proved it true by choosing, every ordinary morning after, to carry what I'd learned to carry alone. The end.